He is often considered the greatest writer in the English language and arguably the most influential literary figure the world has ever known. His plays have been performed for over 4 centuries, and his words have shaped how millions of people think about love, power, betrayal, and death. But beneath the floor of a quiet church in a small English town, something is wrong with his grave. And for centuries there have been whispers that his skull was taken, not by accident, not by natural decay, but by thieves who broke into his burial place under the cover of darkness and stole the head of the most famous writer in history. What makes this even more unsettling is the fact that he appeared to have predicted this very crime. Carved into the stone above his burial place is a curse, a direct warning to anyone who would dare to disturb his bones, and yet it seems that someone ignored that warning completely. So what really happened to the skull of William Shakespeare? And is it truly missing from his grave? William Shakespeare was born in 1564 in Stratford-upon-Avon, a market town in Warwickshire, England. His father, John Shakespeare, was a successful glove maker and wool dealer who held several civic positions in the town, including the role of alderman. His mother, Mary Arden, came from a family of higher social standing and brought with her a modest inheritance of land. William was the third of 8 children, though not all of his siblings survived into adulthood. He was likely educated at the King's New School in Stratford, where he would have received a solid grounding in Latin, rhetoric, and classical literature. These studies would later influence his writing enormously, though he never attended university. In 1582, at the age of just 18, Shakespeare married Anne Hathaway, a woman 8 years his senior. Their first daughter, Susanna, was born 6 months later, and in 1585, twins Hamnet and Judith followed. But at some point in the late 1580s, Shakespeare left Stratford and made his way to London. The reasons for this move remain unclear. Some historians believe he may have joined a traveling theater company. Others suggest he was fleeing legal trouble or simply seeking better opportunities. Whatever the cause, it was in London that Shakespeare's life changed forever. By the early 1590s, he had established himself as both an actor and a playwright. His early works attracted attention, and by the middle of the decade, he was a shareholder in the Lord Chamberlain's Men, one of the most prominent acting companies in England. This company would later become the King's Men under the patronage of King James I. Shakespeare's output during these years was extraordinary. He wrote comedies, histories, tragedies, and romances at a pace that astonished his contemporaries. Works that are still performed today were written during this period, and his ability to capture the full range of human emotion in language that was both poetic and accessible set him apart from every other writer of his age. He became wealthy too. He purchased one of the largest houses in Stratford, a property known as New Place, and invested in land and tithes. Despite his success in London, Shakespeare maintained strong ties to his hometown throughout his life. By around 1613, Shakespeare appears to have retired from the London stage and returned to Stratford permanently. The reasons for his retirement are not entirely clear. Some historians believe his health may have been declining. Others suggest he had simply achieved everything he wished to achieve in the theater and wanted to spend his remaining years in comfort. But whatever the reason, Shakespeare's final years were spent in relative quiet. He was no longer writing at the rate he once had, and he appeared to be settling his affairs. In January of 1616, Shakespeare drafted his will. This document, which still survives, gives a detailed account of how he wished his property and belongings to be distributed. He left the bulk of his estate to his eldest daughter Susanna and her husband John Hall. His younger daughter Judith received a more modest settlement, and in a line that has puzzled and amused historians for centuries, he left his wife Anne his second-best bed. The meaning of this bequest has been debated endlessly. Some see it as a slight, others argue it was simply a legal formality, as Anne would have been entitled to a portion of the estate by law regardless. But the will also reveals something important. Shakespeare appears to have been in declining health when he signed it. His signature on the document is shaky and uneven, quite different from earlier examples of his handwriting. This suggests that by early 1616, the playwright was already seriously unwell. Now, the exact cause of Shakespeare's death has never been definitively established. He died on the 23rd of April, 1616, at the age of 52. A later account written by the vicar of Stratford, John Ward, some 50 years after the event, claimed that Shakespeare had been drinking heavily with fellow writers Ben Jonson and Michael Drayton, and that he contracted a fever as a result. It was said that Shakespeare, Drayton, and Jonson had a merry meeting and it seems drank too hard, for Shakespeare died of a fever there contracted. However, this account was written decades later and may not be reliable. Other theories have been proposed over the years. Some historians suggest he may have suffered from typhus, which was common in the period. Others have speculated about syphilis, kidney disease, or even poisoning. But the truth is that no medical records survive from the time of his death, and we simply do not know for certain what killed him. What we do know is that Shakespeare was buried 2 days after his death, on the 25th of April, 1616, inside the chancel of Holy Trinity Church in Stratford-upon-Avon. This was a position of high honor. Burial within the chancel, close to the altar, was reserved for individuals of significant social standing, and Shakespeare's status as a tithe holder in the parish entitled him to this prominent resting place. Now, Shakespeare was not buried in an elaborate tomb like many of the monarchs and nobles of the period. He was interred beneath the floor of the chancel, in a grave that lies approximately 17 feet below a painted memorial bust mounted on the wall above. The grave itself is marked by a simple stone slab set into the floor. But what makes this grave unlike almost any other in England is the inscription carved into the stone. It does not bear Shakespeare's name. Instead, it carries a 4-line verse, and this verse is a direct and threatening curse aimed at anyone who would dare to move or disturb his bones. The inscription reads, "Good friend, for Jesus' sake, forbear to dig the dust enclosed here. Blessed be the man that spares these stones, and cursed be he that moves my bones." This is important for later in the story. The curse has been the subject of much discussion among historians and scholars. Some believe Shakespeare wrote it himself, knowing that it was common practice in English churches to dig up older graves and move bones to charnel houses to make room for new burials. Charnel houses were buildings or vaults where old skeletal remains were stored after being removed from graves. This practice was widespread and would have been well known to Shakespeare. The prospect of his bones being dug up, thrown into a pile with hundreds of other remains and forgotten clearly troubled him. And so it is believed he composed the curse specifically to prevent this from happening. And for the most part, the curse appears to have worked. Unlike many other graves of the period, Shakespeare's burial place has never been officially opened or excavated. His remains have never been formally examined. No bones have been lifted out for scientific analysis. The church and local authorities have consistently refused requests to open the grave, citing the curse and the sanctity of the burial. But the curse did not stop everyone. For centuries, rumors circulated in Stratford and beyond that Shakespeare's skull had been stolen from his grave. The story was treated by many as local folklore, a colorful tale with no real evidence behind it. But the rumors persisted, and they always pointed to the same basic claim, that at some point, probably in the late 1700s, someone had broken into the grave from below or from the side and removed the skull. One of the most detailed accounts of this alleged theft appeared in 1879 in a publication called The Argosy Magazine. The article described how a group of men, supposedly acting on a bet or a dare, had entered Holy Trinity Church at night and dug down into Shakespeare's grave. According to this account, the men successfully removed the skull and took it away. The story claimed that the skull eventually ended up in a different church entirely, miles away from Stratford, where it was kept hidden for years before being placed in an ossuary or bone vault. The article was treated with skepticism by many scholars. It was published in a popular magazine rather than an academic journal. The details were vague in places, and the author relied on oral tradition rather than documented evidence. But it was also strikingly specific in other ways. It named locations, it described the method of entry, and it claimed that the skull had been kept in a church in a village some distance from Stratford. For over a century, the story sat in a kind of historical limbo. It was not proven, it was not disproven, it was simply repeated, debated, and left unresolved. But in 2016, 400 years after Shakespeare's death, A team of archaeologists was given permission to conduct a non-invasive investigation of the grave using ground-penetrating radar. This technology sends radar pulses into the ground and creates images of what lies beneath the surface without the need to dig. It is used in archaeology to locate buried structures, vaults, and remains. And it was hoped that this investigation would finally settle the question of whether Shakespeare's grave was intact. The results were remarkable. The radar scans confirmed that Shakespeare's grave was unusually shallow. It was not a deep vault or a walled chamber as some had assumed. Instead, it appeared to be a simple earth-cut grave, dug into the ground beneath the chancel floor. But the most significant finding was at the head end of the grave. The radar images showed a clear disturbance in the area where the skull would be expected to lie. The soil at the head of the grave appeared to have been disturbed and replaced at some point after the original burial. The rest of the grave appeared largely intact, but at the head end, the readings were anomalous. They were consistent with the idea that someone had dug into the grave, removed something, and then filled the hole back in. The lead archaeologist on the project stated that the evidence was consistent with the skull having been removed. He did not claim absolute certainty. Ground-penetrating radar has limitations, and interpreting its results requires care. But the disturbance at the head end was clear and difficult to explain by natural settlement alone. This was a shocking discovery. It suggested that the story published in the Argosy magazine in 1879 may have been based on real events. Someone, at some point in the centuries after Shakespeare's death, appears to have broken into his grave and taken his skull. The curse carved into the stone above had not been enough to stop them. Now, the question of where the skull might be today remains unanswered. The 1879 account claimed it was taken to a church in a nearby region, but investigations of the locations mentioned in the article have not produced conclusive results. Some researchers have examined bone collections and ossuaries in churches across the English Midlands, hoping to identify the missing skull. But without DNA evidence from Shakespeare's known descendants to compare against, positive identification would be extremely difficult even if a candidate's skull were found. It is also worth noting that in the 18th and 19th centuries, the theft of skulls and bones from famous graves was not as unusual as it might seem today. There was a thriving trade in relics and curiosities. The skulls of notable individuals were sometimes stolen and sold to private collectors or displayed in personal cabinets of curiosity. Phrenology, the now discredited science of reading character from the shape of the skull, was also popular during this period, and the skulls of famous people were considered especially valuable for study. It is entirely possible that Shakespeare's skull was taken for one of these reasons: a trophy, a relic, a specimen. And over the decades and centuries that followed, its provenance may have been lost as it passed from hand to hand, collector to collector, until no one could say for certain where it had come from. The grave of William Shakespeare has never been formally opened. The church and the local community have maintained a firm position against excavation, and the curse inscribed on the stone continues to serve as a warning. But beneath that stone, the evidence suggests that the grave is not as it once was. The greatest writer in the English language was laid to rest in 1616 in a quiet church in a small English town. He was buried with a curse above his head, a plea to the future to leave him in peace, and for 4 centuries, that plea was officially honored. No archaeologist has lifted the stone, no scientist has examined the bones, but someone, in the darkness of a night long past, appears to have ignored the warning entirely. They broke into the grave, they reached in, and they took the skull of the man whose mind had produced some of the most extraordinary works ever written. Today, thousands of visitors walk through Holy Trinity Church every year. They stand above the grave, they read the curse, and beneath their feet, the bones of William Shakespeare lie still. All of them, it seems, except one. The skull, the very seat of that unmatched imagination, may no longer be there at all. And if it was taken, it has never been returned. The curse warned of consequences, but whoever took the skull was willing to take that chance. And over 200 years later, we are still living with the mystery they left behind. Thank you for watching. And if you enjoyed this video, please make sure to like and subscribe. And once again, thank you so much for watching.